Hello, class. My name is George Annie. I'm your facilitator for this course, PHS 511, Applied Epidemiology. Epidemiology is one of the basic sciences of public health and deals with the study of the determinants, the deterrents, those factors that lead to the existence of diseases and other health-related conditions in the population, with the aim of preventing recurrence. That is what epidemiology is. Applied epidemiology, on the other hand, is an aspect of epidemiology that deals with the tracking of diseases and its indicators in the population, with the aim of reducing the risk factors associated and improving the health of the population. When you track disease indicators, how do we mean when we track disease indicators, and what are disease indicators? For example, when you have malaria, malaria has symptoms of malaria like fever, cough, headaches, and sore throat. These are symptoms of malaria. And then you go further to do a blood test to find out if there is malaria parasite in your blood. These are indicators. The symptoms, the blood test result, these are indicators of a disease called malaria. And when you do that for other diseases, you're looking at the indicators of those diseases. That is applied epidemiology. Epidemiology as a course appears difficult to many, especially as you have numerous diseases and health-related conditions, including the newly emerging global diseases of public health importance to chase after. As one of the basic sciences of public health, epidemiology is very important, especially post-graduation in your practice of public health. It's akin to having a car without an engine. The engine is epidemiology and the car is public health. So if you don't have the engine to drive the car will not drive you anywhere. That is what epidemiology is. So you need it as a rudiment to practice public health when you graduate. So it is important that you understand these rudiments. I am going to break it down as simple as possible to make it a wonderful learning experience for you. Epidemiology is interesting that you have the communicable disease epidemiology and the non-communicable disease epidemiology. For the purposes of this lesson, we're going to be focusing on communicable disease epidemiology, and we shall be discussing definition and concept of communicable diseases. So get on board and let us ride on. So communicable diseases, we all know, we've been hearing of communicable diseases. They are actually leading cause of morbidity and mortality globally, especially in developing countries like ours, Nigeria. Among the leading diseases in this category, usually in our country, we look at diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. These are estimated to cause 10% of annual global deaths. As you are aware, new diseases are also continuing to emerge and re-emerge globally, from the SARS era to the most and current dreaded COVID-19 of the coronavirus strain that practically brought the world to halt. In Nigeria, other diseases like yellow fever, Lassa fever, cholera, and cerebrospinal meningitis still occur in epidemic fashion, creating a magnitude of mortality and morbidity burden to wellness, health infrastructure, economic productivity of the country. Some people say some of these diseases that are emerging and re-emerging are all due to rapid migration, urbanization, faster travel between nations, overcrowding, poor nutrition, poor environmental sanitation standards. As a student, you will need to know the trends and factors that produce these diseases in our community and how to prevent them. That is why you are studying applied epidemiology. Let us start with a few questions. What is a communicable disease? What constitute the organisms that cause communicable diseases? So the objectives of this lesson is that after you've completed your learning experience, you should be able to define what communicable disease is. You should be able to identify the organisms that cause communicable diseases, as well as understand the meaning and the use of terms like agent, infection, reservoir of infectious agent, resistance, immunity, carrier, and vector. So let's hit the ball rolling. What is communicable disease? What do we understand as a communicable disease? A communicable disease is also known as infectious disease, by the way. It's usually transmitted from person to person, animal to a person, or the other way around, vice versa. Is usually acquired through contact, directly by having a contact with someone, or indirectly through what we call fomites or vectors. Fomites are basically like instruments, equipment in the hospital or in anywhere, furniture and other things in the office. You could call them fomites. Or through vectors, conveyors of infectious agents. Those are vectors. So you could get it through that form. Or through an infected person or an animal. Usually these communicable diseases, the agents that cause these communicable diseases are called microorganisms. And these microorganisms can be a bacteria, it can be a virus, it can be fungus, it can be protozoa. That's how we define and identify these agents. I would like to take you through what we call the idea or the principles involved in these communicable diseases. It's known that 60% of global burden of diseases are actually non-communicable diseases, not communicable diseases. 28% are accounted by the communicable diseases, while 60% of global burden of diseases is non-communicable. And it's the factors or the conditions that are related to these diseases are usually maternal, neonatal, and nutritional diseases. However, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is due to increased globalization and urban migration, sub-Saharan Africa's countries seem to be closing this gap and giving a double, what we call a double burden outlook. Because our problem before now has always been communicable diseases. So now we're beginning, because of this increased globalization and urban migration, we're beginning to close the gap between the communicable and non-communicable disease, creating that double burden. Our burden of communicable disease has always been, like I said, HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. Lassa fever, however, yellow fever, cholera, cerebrospinal meningitis, have always been occurring in an episodic manner. Globally, the new entrants of emerging and re-emerging diseases like the SARS, the swine flu, the avian flu, the Zika virus, and most recently coronavirus, pose a threat to public health, emergency response structures, and global health security. So many people have given reasons why such things are happening. Some people say it is due to faster travel mechanisms like air travel between countries. Some people say it is due to urbanization and increased migration. Some people say it is due to poor socioeconomic status like water sanitation, nutrition, overcrowding, poor income, poor education, and unemployment or underemployment. These are factors that people say it's contributing to burden of communicable diseases. So we will try to look at terms that you'll be coming across as we discuss communicable diseases. There are terms you need to know, and these terms are example of one of those terms is an agent of a disease. An agent is the main cause of the disease itself. That is what an agent is. And this agent is usually can be a biological, physical, or chemical entity which is capable of causing infection or disease. That entity, whether it's biological, physical, chemical. For the purposes of communicable diseases, we will be dwelling more on the biological agents, the biological entity, which could be bacteria, fungus, virus, or protozoa. Those are biological agents that usually cause communicable diseases. And they are agents. That's what agent is. So with this, you understand what an agent is. An agent can be a biological, physical, or chemical entity. So, but for the purposes of communicable disease, which we're discussing, agent here is a biological agent, which could be bacteria, virus, fungus, or protozoa. And that takes us to what we call infection. Infection is simply the entry and multiplication of that agent, that infectious agent in the body. That is what infection. So when that agent gets into your body and multiplies in your body becomes infected. That is infection. So when it gets into the body tissues of man or animal, it leads to what we call cell injury. And it has different ways at which it can get into the body. It can get into your body through airborne, through your nasal mucosa. That is what the nasal mucosa is. Through the skin, your body, through your skin, through your mouth, or through your genital tract. It can move in through your genital tract, the female genital tract or the male genital tract. That is how such infectious agent moves into the body and infects you. So we go further to talk about what we call the reservoir of infection. A reservoir of infection is simply any person or an animal or even plant or soil or inanimate object where that agent that causes infection lives in, thrives, or depends on for survival and multiplies. From there, it can now infect the next person or the next host or the next animal. That particular person, animal, soil, or inanimate object where that agent lives in, that bacteria, that protozoa, that virus lives in, and from there it multiplies and then infects its next person. That is called a reservoir of infection. Now, there's what we call resistance. When this agent gets into the person it is infecting, the resistance is your host defense. That barrier, that preventive mechanism, that's what we might call it, preventive mechanism, that barrier your body poses to that infectious agent getting into you is the resistance of your body. That's what we call the host defense against disease, the barrier to invasion and multiplication of infectious agent. Or some people might call it immunity factor. So this takes us to what is immunity. Immunity is basically the antibodies in your system that fights germs or fights those infectious agents. Those antibodies in your body that fights the viruses, the bacteria, the fungus, and the protozoa, those agents. So, and this immunity can be passive immunity or it can be active immunity. A passive immunity is usually a transient immunity. That's what a passive immunity is. And it can be natural, like the one transferred from mother to child, or it can be artificial, like the specific protective antibodies from immunized animals. Example is the common ATS people receive. ATS people receive when they have tetanus infection is an example of an artificial passive immunity. ATS is equine tetanus serum. That's what ATS is. Is a form of immunized hyperimmune serum which can be used when somebody has tetanus infection. That's what ATS is. So it's an example of passive artificial immunity. So, and you have also the passive transient, which is natural, like the one that mother confers on a child. When a child is born, a child has a form of acquired transient immunity from the mother, which lasts for probably a year, and that actually determines the number of vaccination a child receives. As that mother to child immunity fades, the child begins to receive all those vaccines at different age. That actually describes the immunity that is conferred on a child by those vaccinations. As the mother's own fades away, the child begins to receive those, vaccinations that will now bestow on that child what we call the active immunity against diseases and infection. So the mother to child immunity is an example of passive natural immunity. So you have active immunity as well. The active immunity can also be natural. It can also be artificial. Example of a natural active immunity is that you get when you get infected by any organism or any maybe bacteria, protozoa. Your body develops an immunity against further or subsequent infections. Then artificial is like artificial immunity. Artificial active is when you're inoculated, you're given vaccinations against those infective agents like measles vaccination and the likes, polio and all that. That's like active artificial immunity. So this takes us to carrier, what we call carrier of infection. Can be a human or animal that harbors infectious agents with no clinical disease. That means you have that infective agent, but you're not showing any signs and symptoms of a disease. That's what a carrier is. And a carrier can also transmit such infection. A carrier can be asymptomatic carrier. Like in this COVID era, there are people who have come down with COVID infection, and there are people who never showed any symptom of COVID, even though they had the infection. So those people are called asymptomatic carriers. They have the COVID virus in them. They are infected, but are not showing symptoms. But they can infect others. So they are asymptomatic carriers. Then incubatory carriers are those who are incubating the infection within the incubation period of the disease. They are incubating the infection. Like COVID, which is The incubation period of COVID is 14 days. So when you are infected with COVID, before the COVID develops into symptoms in you, you are an incubatory carrier. Convalescent carrier is somebody who has had the infection, suffered the disease, and is now recuperating. When you're recuperating, and that's you're getting better, an infective agent is still within you, you are a convalescent carrier. Then a temporary carrier could be someone who is just having the infective agent in him, but could transmit that infective agent to someone else. In other words, the infective agent can be temporal in you. It can leave your system, your body, and find another host. It can leave you completely. So that means it's in you temporarily and can leave you completely and find another host. That is a temporary carrier. Then a chronic carrier is someone who has suffered infection or has the infective agent in him endlessly. It doesn't leave the person. That is a chronic carrier, but you can infect others. So another thing we'll look at is a vector. Another term we'll look at is a vector. Who is a vector? What is a vector? A vector is an arthropod. There are a group of insects we call arthropods. So a vector is an arthropod which transfers infectious agent from source of infection to a susceptible host. Example of an arthropod is mosquito. Is a known arthropod which transmits plasmodium parasites that causes malaria from one person to another, or from the person who is infected to someone who is healthy, and thus causing infection in the other person. That is what we call an arthropod. That mosquito is an arthropod, and by the way it carries that infective agent from one person to the other, it's a vector. So in summary of our lesson on communicable, definition of communicable diseases and the concepts like the terms we have described, we've learned that communicable diseases are infectious diseases transmitted from man to man or animal to man and vice versa. We also know that the organisms like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and fungi are involved. We have also understood the meaning and the use of the terms like agent of infection, the infection itself, reservoir of infectious agents, resistance, what immunity means, carrier of infection, and vector of infection. I hope and believe that you have actually had a wonderful learning experience. Thank you for listening, and see you some other time. Bye.